Okay, simple summary for this week is about the United States Constitution. I'm going to try once again and fail once again to keep this short, but here we go. So, last week we talked about the American Revolution, right? Which is the war that the United States fought to become independent. And in 1783, the United States became independent. However, that's not the end of the story. It might be the end of a certain movie, but the question is, then what? What independent, free, but free to do what? What kind of government will the United States have? Are we going to have another king? Which was, by the way, a real possibility. What would the government look like? And so that was not settled. There was a document that was in effect at the time called the Articles of Confederation. You could kind of think of it as sort of a bare bones prototype of a constitution, but it didn't work. It didn't work because there was nothing to bind the states together to get them to actually do anything. And so for the 3 or 4 years after the revolution, there really wasn't an American government. And keep in mind, it wasn't clear to people in 1783 or 1787, or really until after the Civil War, that there was going to be an American nation, because a lot of people thought of their state as their nation. And in fact, when the Civil War began, the reason Robert E. Lee was not the commander of the Union Army was that he was like, I can't fight against Virginia, that's my home. So the Articles of Confederation didn't work. And there were a few sort of troubling things that happened. And the American government, such as it is, to the extent that that even really existed, was unable to deal with it. And it kind of frightened people. One was called Shays' Rebellion. The man's name is Shays. So there's not an apostrophe there. And led a rebellion in New England that was put down, but it was a little touch and go for a while. And, there's no real American army, there's no commander-in-chief, the Congress doesn't have the power to tax and levy funds and that sort of thing. And so people by 1787 realized something had to be done. But there had been a lot of opposition to doing anything. Keep in mind, people just fought a revolution. They don't necessarily want to set up a powerful new government. They just fought a revolution to get rid of a powerful government, right? So in 1787, James Madison, who would become eventually the father of the Constitution, arrived in Philadelphia for a meeting that was called to discuss the situation. And he arrived early. And he used that time to plan. And he used that time to talk to people, whoever else was there, but mainly to write a plan. So that when people showed up, he was more ready than they were. And this meeting that people showed up to turned into the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that wrote the Constitution that we have today. But it is important to understand that the people who showed up to that meeting did not know that that's necessarily what was going to happen. They didn't think they didn't say, all right, let's say you're from Georgia, okay, and you're called to this meeting. You're not going to, kiss your wife goodbye and say, honey, I'm going off to Philadelphia. I'm going to the Constitutional Convention. No, you're going to a meeting. That's it. That's all anybody knew, a meeting to discuss things. Because honestly, if you had tried to call a constitutional convention, enough states would have refused to attend, because a lot of the smaller states in particular were worried about any new government basically taking things over and telling them what they could do and what they couldn't do. So anyway, Madison gets to this convention early, and meeting, not convention, gets to this meeting early, writes a plan. And on the first day of the meeting, the governor of Virginia stands up and presents Madison's plans. A man named Edwin Randolph, although you don't have to know that. And this became known as the Virginia Plan, which was the basis of the Constitution. Now, Virginia doesn't seem like a big state to us now, but it was one of the major states in of the original 13, and it's where Washington was from, and Jefferson and Madison, and just a powerful state with a lot of people, relatively speaking. And so the Virginia plan called for a powerful federal government, and kind of is pretty close to what we ended up with. I'm oversimplifying here for the sake of time. So the smaller states didn't really like the idea because a powerful government they thought would be dominated by the big states, and then the small states would not really get a chance to be involved and would be at the mercy of the larger ones. And so they came up with their own plan called the New Jersey Plan. It was the representatives from the state of New Jersey, which didn't have a ton of people at the time. There were any number of important people here. These are the founding fathers, right? George Washington came out of retirement from Virginia, from his home in Mount Vernon, and agreed to preside over this, what became a convention. He sat there quietly. He didn't really participate, but he gave it credibility just by being there. Who are the other founding fathers? Well, you got John Adams, but he's not there. He's overseas. He's serving as an ambassador. The other major one is Thomas Jefferson, also not there. This is one of the things you can tell. I had a student years and years ago that was talking about Jefferson at the Constitutional Convention, and I was like, that's interesting. He was in France. Guess you didn't see Hamilton. He was the ambassador to France. He wasn't there. He knew what was going on. He was like getting letters from James Madison, but he wasn't involved. This was Madison's kind of show. Another relatively minor person at the time who was there was Alexander Hamilton. But this was before he was powerful, so he was just one of the delegates. And so all summer they spent in Philadelphia, how can I put this? Trying to come to some sort of compromise. Something that could get a government that could get things done, but a government that also wouldn't be so powerful that it would trample over everybody and take things over. And so they came up with what they kind of settled on in final form of having a president, not a king. And the president would be popularly elected. Actually, not really popularly. It's from the Electoral College. They came up with that. But my point is, it's not Congress appointing the president. And they would have 3 branches of government. There would be a judiciary, and there would be a Congress, and there would be a president, and they would kind of check and balance each other out. And Congress, here's the big one that they couldn't figure out. How do you get into Congress? Or how many votes does each state get in Congress? Because if you're in a big state at the time, like Virginia, you're like, well, we have more people, so we should get more votes. And if you're in, I don't know, it's a good small state at the time. I was going to say Vermont, but they weren't quite in yet. But I'll use Vermont anyway. If you're Vermont, you're like, no, everybody should have the same number of votes. And so this was going to tear things apart. And eventually they came to a compromise where they said, okay, fine. In the House of Representatives, which is one house of Congress, you get a certain number of members of Congress based on how many people you have. That's why Texas has, 1 trillion congressmen. I don't know how many it has anymore. It changes every couple of years. And that's why Vermont still only has 1, because basically nobody lives in Vermont. California's got the most people. They have the most congressmen. But in the Senate, on the other side, every state gets 2 senators. Texas has 2. California has 2. Wyoming, which has like 11 cows and 5 people, they have 2 too. Everybody gets 2. That's the compromise. So eventually what became the convention adjourned, and that doesn't just put this government into effect, because the states have to sign off on this. It's a process that we call ratification. They have to ratify. It makes it official. When you ratify if you sign a contract right now to do something, you have to have that you're ratifying it, you're approving it. It's the difference between a handshake deal and a contract, if you take my meaning. the states had to ratify it, a certain number of states, and there were 13 at the time. He needed 9. And so all the debates that they had in Philadelphia were recreated essentially in each state capital, as each state tried to decide to vote up or down. And a lot of people were not sure this was going to work. In fact, the gentleman who presented the Virginia plan, Edmund Randolph, ultimately voted against it. He just was like, what we came up with here is very contradictory, and I'm worried about people's individual safeguards. And from these worries that people had, James Madison wrote, because if you understand the Constitution, it has Article 1, Article 2, goes on, it says what the president does, what the Congress does, and this and that. But it also specifically says that it can be amended. The Constitution is not like the Bible. It's not set in stone. It is essentially a contract between the states. And like any contract, it can be amended. People talk about, for instance, the big one that anybody ever talks about now is the Second Amendment, okay? Which is the right to bear arms. And the Supreme Court has ruled on this. But it, by definition, is an amendment, meaning it is something that was changed from the original meaning. So could it be changed again? Yes. It never will be, but it could be. You could, I guess, change the First Amendment and say that people don't have a right to free speech. Good luck with that. Some of these amendments that were written really don't have any relevance anymore. There's an amendment that says you can't be forced to let a British soldier sleep in your house. Which, I know that sounds weird, but that was something that had been forced upon people when the British were still in charge. Like, hey, guess what? You're putting the soldier in your house. It's called quartering. Some of them are very relevant. The right to bear arms, the right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Some of the things about criminal rights and the right to a fair trial, these are obviously super relevant still. Those first 10 amendments were written, and they are called the Bill of Rights. And they were necessary to make people feel comfortable with the Constitution, that it wasn't we're replacing one monarchy with another. And by the way, if George Washington had wanted to be king, I think he could have been king. The very stature that he had that caused people to automatically assume that he would be the first president correctly meant that he could have done virtually anything. And of course, later on when he serves as president, and he could have stayed for life. He didn't have to give it up after 2 terms. Okay, I'm going way too long here, so I'm going to wrap this up. This is the basic story of the Constitution. It has been amended many times. It's been in the high 20s now. We've changed what certain things mean. There's big famous ones like the 13th Amendment that outlaws slavery. The 22nd Amendment is a big one because it limits how many times a president can be elected. It is a living document. It can be amended. If there's enough political will, people could get together and have a constitutional convention or propose an amendment now. And if enough of the states will ratify it, it will become law. The founders intended it this way. It was not meant to be static and not meant to be a thing that can ever be fixed, because they understood in 1787 that they didn't know what the future held. For instance, what does the Constitution say about nuclear weapons? Nothing. A big weapon back then was like a musket. They knew they couldn't foresee what the future would hold, so they created a government that could adapt with the times. So that's the last takeaway I want you to grasp. Okay, write this up, answer the questions, and we'll go from there.